All right, hi everyone. Welcome to our PBS Tier 1 online series. This afternoon we'll be talking about two different parts of the benchmarks of quality, expectations of rules, and developing lesson plans. So before we get too much into it, if you would just go ahead and type something in the chat box to make sure you can hear me. So let us know by typing either yes or hello in the chat box if you're able to hear the audio. Okay, good. People can hear. That's wonderful. So this is Molly Blair from Student Support Programs and Services.
Hi, this is Alyssa Lipinski.
And we will be talking about PBS with you today. I know teams did some pre-work and turned in school-wide expectations, so we'll be touching on that and kind of the next steps in working with your teams around rules and expectations, including setting up expectations if you don't already have them, developing rules for different settings, and then how to teach those things. So for this section, what we want to know and understand, characteristics of our Tier 1 expectations and rules, consensus as far as expectations and rules to present to the staff.
Okay, and expectations and rules are basically the core curriculum for behavior. So they'll become, if they haven't already, a common language for you and your faculty, and you guys around campus should be using them all the time during all activities. They really should be reflecting your school and community values, right, and also tied to your vision or mission statements of your school also. And they should be supporting like quality citizenship, and we should make sure that the expectations and rules also are they are to help for on-task or active engagement within the classroom, because that's our number one goal, to have our students engaged in the classroom and to be learning. So one of the things that expectations and rules also do are, they enable those academic skills to happen. And also those non-academic skills like social emotional skills, and those behaviors that we want students to be exhibiting in order to be engaged in the classroom.
So these are components of what makes up a core curriculum for behavior. So Tier 1, and we're looking at all students across all tiers. So this is our framework for enhancing our implementation of this whole continuum of support, both academically and behaviorally for everyone. All right, and we are talking about identifying our Tier 1 expectations and how an activity you can engage in with your team to help build consensus around what we want our students to be acting like. What characteristics do we want them to exemplify? So if you don't have consensus around that, maybe your school hasn't communicated expectations or they're not shared by everyone, an activity can be including your staff, parents, students, other stakeholders in brainstorming those characteristics of ideal students, ideas that would inspire change in students and staff, and then narrowing that down to identify 3 to 5 broad expectations, defining those critical attributes. So this can really help with your staff to increase buy-in and increase their cultural fit with the expectations to make sure they have that sense of ownership. It's also useful with parents and students, so they have that ownership and feel like they are heard and their voice is part of that process. And you'll have, when you start having people brainstorm, you'll have many, many items. So you can kind of group them by things that have common themes and then narrow them down to those 3 to 5 broad characteristics that encompass as many of the items as possible. Those items could then be used later on to help define your expectations.
And Molly touched on something that's really important, and we're seeing more and more in lots of our schools, is that schools are really getting their students involved as they come up or they refine or they're supporting their expectations. So whether they tap into student council or a leadership group of students in their school, they're really trying to engage all students in being part of building the expectations, creating the rules, and just being part of the PBS process in general. So something to think about if you don't have a student group already identified, that might be something that you'd like to maybe add or put in your action plan for your particular school.
Okay. So this is how you would structure that ideal student activity. We won't have you actually do this online with us today in the interest of time, but this would involve some brainstorming, and these are guiding questions. So what does an ideal student do? What are those specific behaviors? What engagement, social, and emotional behaviors would they need to demonstrate to be successful? And then those are some examples that people might generate. So you would start getting that brainstorming, that input from stakeholders, and then as a team compiling that master list. What are all the behaviors, eliminating anything that's duplicate, and starting to identify those common themes in one column to come to consensus on at least one theme.
So again, just a tool to help guide you and your team if those expectations aren't already set up or you need to revisit them for some reason.
And when we talk about Tier 1 expectations, we're looking at a list of broadly stated positive behaviors that you want everyone in your school to exhibit. So it's really for everybody, not just students that might be considered problem students. It's also for staff, parents, volunteers, anybody who's part of the school community. And those expectations are your umbrella that capture many behaviors. For example, being responsible would include having your materials, being on time, doing your work on time, asking for makeup work, asking for assistance when you need it, getting help if you see somebody being bullied, all those kinds of things. And they apply across all settings on campus.
So one of the ways to really continue to develop your Tier 1 expectations, if you haven't done so already, or again need to revisit that, is using your school data. So the first step would be to determine the top 3 problem areas in your school and kind of see what expectations fall under those areas and what expectations then need to be developed to be reflective of what's going on in those specific areas.
So using Pasco Star, you can see your school-wide data and really hone in on what areas are of concern. I know across the district we see many schools focusing on the bus because that's an area where we see a lot of discipline referrals happening. So that's just one example. Okay. So this is kind of an activity you can also take back with your team if you don't have school-wide expectations. So we talked before about that first activity, and we'll provide you all the slides for these, where you identified some characteristics of an ideal student and narrowed those down to some, several broadly stated characteristics or themes. So based on that, we would want to identify your 3 to 5 positively stated expectations based on your school's common themes and values. And since staff, parents, students, all of your key stakeholders have had some input, they'll be more likely to buy into these expectations. So thinking about what your expectations might be. We want to make sure they're defined in a way students would understand and that they address the needs in your building. So they're connected with your discipline data.
Okay. The other part of our Core 1 curriculum for behavior is really moving on to then the rules. And these rules are based on settings throughout the school. So just some guidelines if rules have not been created already that align with your school-wide expectations is that the rules should be specific skills or behaviors that you want the students to exhibit. And of course they should be positively stated, so we want to tell students what they should be doing, not what we don't want them to be doing. Again, we often use the example, instead of saying no running, the student might then, skip, hop, jump down the hallway. So we want to say use walking feet. We want to tell them exactly what behavior we want them to demonstrate. We also want rules to be limited in number. So 3 to 5 rules is usually appropriate within each setting. And then, of course, always aligned and tied back with the school's mission statement and then aligned with also the school-wide expectations.
So this is a little chart that emphasizes the difference between expectations and rules. You might hear people using those terms interchangeably, but they're actually different. There are some distinct differences. So you'll see that in schools' hallway expectations. So for example, you'll see that hallway expectations and bus expectations may be used in a school when in fact they're talking about rules for those different settings. Because remember, expectations are consistent across your building, across the setting, but rules may be specific to that setting. So there are some similarities. Like we said, they're stated positively. It's what we want them to do. They're limited in number, so everyone can remember them. They're aligned with our mission for our school, and they clarify what would be the criteria for doing that successfully. But your expectations, those are those broad things. They apply to everyone, all settings, measurable and observable. Rules, however, describe your specific behaviors for specific settings. They may apply to specific groups of students. So you might have particular rules for kids who are participating in an athletic activity or on a field trip. And rules help clarify the expectation. So what does it look like to be responsible in the cafeteria? And what does it look like to be respectful at a school dance? Things like that. So we'll go into a group activity now. And we'll have you guys type in the chat box for each one whether you think it's an expectation or a rule. So number 1, be considerate. Do you think that is an expectation or a rule? Okay, we see some consensus. It's an expectation because that's something that would apply to everybody. All settings, no matter who you are, what you're doing in the building, that's an expectation that you're considerate.
Excellent. Number 2, place food items in their proper containers. Expectation or rule? Veronica is a quick typer.
All right, very good. So you guys got the hang of it. That's a rule, so it's probably for maybe a cafeteria setting. Wouldn't be relevant everywhere, like on a school bus maybe, or at PE, you wouldn't be worried about food items. So this might be an example of what it looks like to be responsible in the cafeteria. What about number 3? Remain seated during instruction. Expectation or rule? Okay, so some differences of opinion there. That one would be considered an expectation. I'll talk a little bit, I'm sorry, it would be considered a rule. I'm misspeaking here. So remain seated during instruction would be a rule. The reason why, remember, you would not necessarily have that rule for every activity and every person on campus. So we don't expect that for every instructional activity that everyone remains seated.
Right. That can also fall under some expectation categories, such as, being responsible. Because to remain in your seat, you're being responsible, you're being safe. So again, it's describing maybe a specific expectation that you have.
So it might connect back to, being in your seat. It relates to being safe on the school bus or being responsible or respectful during whole group instruction. But we also need to remember there are a lot of activities that go on where kids don't have to be in their seats.
Right. And one thing also that we need to remember that they're observable and measurable. So rules are observable and measurable. So something to keep in mind when you're trying to decipher between the two.
All right.
Okay, moving on.
Be a problem solver. All right, so we've got some consensus. That one is an expectation. Again, that's something we can expect of everyone in our building across all settings. Regardless of who they are or what they're engaged in, we'd expect people to use their problem-solving skills. And that might look different if you're in the science lab versus PE versus a football game. But that general expectation would apply to everybody.
Okay. Number 5, use an inside voice. Expectation or rule?
All right, I think you guys are getting the hang of it. That would be a rule. Again, it wouldn't apply across every setting.
Right.
It would be a specific rule for maybe how you show respect in a classroom setting or in the media or in a certain environment or situation at school. All right, last one. Keep all 4 legs of your chair on the floor. What do you think, rule or expectation?
Excellent. That one again is a rule. Okay, guys, I think you guys did a great job.
I think we've got the hang of it, and I'm glad we had a chance to practice with those because that can be tricky thinking through sometimes when you first start differentiating. Okay, what are our expectations, what are the rules, and what's the difference? Okay. So once your team has established those school-wide expectations, we're ready to start looking at some Tier 1 rules. So since rules are based on data, over time they might need to change, and it's okay for rules to change because you still have that broad expectation of the expectations that you've established with consensus from your stakeholders.
So something to keep in mind, whether you have a matrix or rules established already for your expectations, and you've been using them, for X amount of years, or you start off at the beginning of the year with certain rules. It might be necessary for a rule in the cafeteria, maybe to be that you've been using walk facing forward with both hands on your lunch tray. And at mid-year, maybe after looking at some data, it might need to be replaced with place all of your garbage in the garbage can. Or the data might say something else that you might need to change some of your rules. So again, our rules, our expectations all come down to your discipline data.
Okay, so this is an example of a matrix that provides kind of a summary of what we talked about. So rules are aligned with expectations. They're stated positively. You don't have too many for each setting. Not every setting has a rule for each expectation, so you really have those key points there, and they're based on the main problems or the main needs in that particular setting, and they're observable, they're measurable. So every expectation doesn't need to have a rule attached to it in every setting. Some rules might fall under 1 to 2 expectations also for a given setting. So just some examples, if you're looking at this elementary school matrix, for be safe, that looks a little bit different in the hallway. We have walk to the right. Cafeteria, we have some specifics. Recess, we have other specifics. And so a school would develop these rules based on what their data shows, what their needs are. Okay, here's another example for a middle school. Expectations in the bathroom. So they use ROAR. They have an acronym for their expectations. So they have respect, organization, attitude, and responsibility. So in the bathroom, they've defined what each of those things looks like for a middle school student. So this is something that you could do with your team if you feel like you're ready to start developing those Tier 1 rules.
Yeah, or if they are developed, if you want to kind of validate why you have those rules in place, it's also something that you can do with your team as well. So you would go ahead and identify the top 3 problem non-classroom locations on campus, and you can use Pasco Star to do so. And then you can, with the team, describe the specific behaviors that generated the referrals in each of the locations, kind of come up with some rules to address the problem behaviors, and then again making that connection and alignment to those expectations as well.
So thinking about those settings that are common to the campus, like cafeteria, restroom, hallway, and bus, it's very important that you include representation from the staff that monitor those areas to really get buy-in with the rules. So for example, if we're talking about cafeteria, you want your food and nutrition staff, your people that monitor the cafeteria to have a voice there. If you're talking about rules for PE, you'd want to make sure your PE teachers are part of that conversation.
Right. Rules for the bus, you'd want bus monitors or people who are outside during, dismissal or an arrival to be part of that meeting as well. Okay, so the next part kind of gets into procedures and routines. So we've already talked about expectations, rules, how they align with those expectations, and now procedures and routines. So procedures and routines are really the specific steps taught to students to facilitate task completion. And it really helps to clarify the difference between expectations, rules that are taught, and
your procedures, your classroom procedures that help you get your routines done on a day-to-day basis. So remember, your expectations are few in number, and they're common across the entire school building.
And a lot of times, if you teach the procedures, it'll cut down the need for lots of rules. And you'll see what we mean in the next few slides. But one example of, a procedure that needs to be taught could be, going through the lunch line. That could happen at the beginning of the year, or based on some discipline data and observations, it might be an ongoing procedure that needs to be taught. But again, some of those steps in going through the lunch line, walking in a single file, tell attendant your lunch number, know your lunch number, right? Go to your seat, things of that nature.
Turning in work, getting a pencil if you need one, things like that in a classroom could also be procedures.
Morning routine. So if you guys can go ahead and kind of type in into the box over there what procedures you find are really important for faculty members to teach students, whether it's at the beginning of the year or throughout the year. What are some procedures that are really important for students to be taught? Excellent. So we have a few examples, and they're all great examples.
Transitioning, that's
yes.
huge. We find that transition times are when we see a lot of, if kids don't know the procedure or they're not sure what the expectations are, you can see some problems during transitions.
Sure. Even walking on the sidewalk, Laura had mentioned, some schools need to teach those procedures that you pass on the right or you pass on the left or, where you stop at each of the posts before you turn and things of that nature to help with the flow so we can get from point A to point B and then be engaged in instruction sooner rather than later.
Arrival procedures, sitting in a learning position, so what does that look like? What about if you're tardy, what to do?
Yep.
Who do you go to and how do you enter the classroom properly?
Even something as little as when you need to use the restroom in class. What are those procedures that you don't interrupt instruction, but that you communicate in some way to let the teacher know that you need to use the restroom? Those types of procedures also will help eliminate interruptions in engagement and instructional time, and that's what this is all about.
So like we mentioned before, classroom procedures alleviate the need for too many rules. They're aligned to the expectations, as really everything involving behavior is, but hopefully they help us limit the number of rules. So procedures are different than rules. They define those routines, what the teacher and students engage in on a regular basis, and they address those common issues that come up throughout the day, which you guys identified many of those, like going to the restroom, asking a question, turning in papers. While rules are targeting specific behavior problems in a location. So telling people the specific rules for talking, for avoiding teasing and bullying, for academic integrity, things like that. So up to this point, we've focused on school-wide areas, and these may be the easiest places for teams to start implementing because everyone uses those areas. The classroom's a little different because teachers have autonomy over their classrooms, but it's important that we share some guidelines in order to support the Tier 1 system. So this slide really shows the guidelines for how Tier 1 expectations should be used within the classroom setting. They should be posted and taught and be the basis for discipline. We'll talk more about what those activities actually look like in later sections, but we're kind of giving you a heads up while we're on the topic of school-wide expectations. So these are just some implementation tips when you are working with your team at your school. That activity we went over with the ideal student, people brainstorming characteristics of what an ideal student looks like and then narrowing down to expectations.
Also surveying the staff and families about behaviors they would most like to see the students exhibit. So for rules, asking about the top problem behavior in a specific setting. Okay, including multiple choice or forced choice to get some of those answers, and then obviously share out those survey results. And then obviously we always want teacher input on the final version of the expectations, right?
And then incentives for staff who are implementing PBS as well. So we talk a lot about incentives for students, but we're also, we're asking staff to make changes and step out of their comfort zone, so we want to acknowledge that as well. Okay, so when you go back to your action plan at your school and start thinking about next steps, I'll give you a few minutes. You probably want to record some of the next activities to engage in with your team. So for example, if you haven't developed expectations, maybe make a note to start engaging in that conversation about what does an ideal student look like and narrowing down those expectations from there. If you have expectations, but maybe there's a need to firm up those rules for common areas and school-wide settings, looking at that rule development. Very important that we also consider number 2, so what actions can we take to inform and involve different stakeholders, so representative staff members, students, families, other community partners. And then if you've looked at your benchmarks of quality for school-wide PBS and you have the items we're talking about right now, 17 through 21, if you notice that some of those items are not in place, making sure that you talk with your team about how you would address that. And we'll post these slides for you as well. So if you want to go back and review and identify some action items, you can do that at a later time as well. Okay, so now we're going into kind of our next section, which is developing a system for teaching appropriate behavior. So it's not enough to assume students know how to behave. Just like kids come to school not knowing maybe how to read or how to do a certain type of math problem, we want to make sure that we're teaching behavior as well. So in this part, we want to understand the rationale, the why behind teaching behavior, what are the guidelines, and then start outlining what our plan might be to actually teach a core behavior curriculum in our school.
So one of the most difficult shifts for teachers to make sometimes is with behavior and how we deal with behavior. So it can be really challenging. The next few slides will cover some of the rationale for teaching and really help provide some background information as to like why we need to teach behavior, just like academics. And the slide that you're looking at now is a really powerful slide, and it might be one that you'd like to use with your faculty also, or a small group that you're working with when talking about behavior or sharing out your PBS information.
So these are some of the reasons or the rationale why we need to teach behavior. So some of those things, cultural differences. Not everyone comes to school with that same perspective or the same cultural beliefs about behavior. Kids come from their own context, from school versus home. Fear of academic failure. So we may have kids avoiding stressful situations. They may need to develop some of those social emotional skills to better handle frustration and better handle failure, because that's really a tool that they'll need in life. And then identifying appropriate alternative behaviors. And then most importantly, perhaps, time out of the classroom. So when kids are not engaged, they're not in class, they're not learning. And that really, if we are spending a lot of time on discipline referrals and removing kids from class, we are very negatively impacting their academic achievement in the long run.
So in teaching behaviors to students, just as we do, academics, it's really taking that proactive investment in teaching those appropriate behaviors so that they can be engaged and learning. Okay, if you're working with your team, these are really some reasons for teaching behavior. So we kind of talked about the why, cultural differences and things of that nature, but reasons for teaching behavior. And this can help you when you're addressing your team talking about it. I'm sure most of you have heard like they should know how to behave by now, right? So again, relating back to how we look about academics. We look at the problem behavior. Is it a skill deficit? Is it a performance deficit? Are the skills not being taught in context but just in isolation? Are they not being rewarded, encouraged? Are they not receiving incentives for demonstrating appropriate behavior? So just something to kind of keep in mind. When establishing new behavior, it needs to be repeated an average of 8 times. And then to unlearn an old behavior and replace it with a new behavior, it must be repeated an average of 28 times. So just think about that for a second. So it's not just even teaching it once, but we need to make sure that the student is being taught it. It's modeled, being taught. The student has opportunities to practice these new skills and then provided feedback if need be multiple times in order for that behavior to stay with that student.
Another common debate is whose responsibility is it to teach behavior? Some people may feel it's the parent's job. Why do we have to deal with behavior at school? This cartoon kind of illustrates the societal responsibility that we all have for teaching behavior, because we really pay now or pay later. If we are not proactive in teaching behaviors in school, kids can end up needing to be cared for in other systems that we don't want them to have to become involved with.
So another common complaint that we hear often is that I don't have time to teach behavior, right? We're given that argument frequently. So just something to keep in mind, that the behavior curriculum should be embedded and ongoing in school activities, initiatives, academics, and throughout the discipline process. So think about what existing initiatives you have at your school. Some examples you'll see up at the screen. Think about how it could be embedded into academic lessons, and then also incorporated into discipline process. So there are about 17 schools out there that are involved in the online planner pilot. There's modules in that pilot through Canvas for reteaching of discipline. That's one way that it could be incorporated into the discipline process with our students.
Also think about including fine arts in that process. So is there a way to use art or music or even like PE activities to reinforce these behaviors? So these are some ideas about either identifying or developing core curriculum for behavior. And some schools do use an existing or prepackaged curriculum, such as Second Step. And if you're using a program like that, it's very important to identify how your Tier 1 expectations are incorporated in each lesson. So you're making that connection back to those school-wide expectations that are specific to your building. There are a lot of resources online. We provided a couple for you here. But if you Google something like lesson plans for responsibility, you'll find a lot of results. So that can be maybe a project for your team once you have some expectations to go and vet some resources that you might want to use in your school building. You can develop your own lesson plans based on that ideal student activity, and then refining down to your expectations and developing unique lessons to address each of those. And very important that we make it easy for staff to use. So we want to provide as much support and as much scaffolding as possible when we're asking staff to implement something new. And very, very important, including family engagement strategies. So how are we connecting back to parents and families? Okay, so looking at lesson plans, we want to make sure we're setting up that context, so explaining why the lesson is important or relevant, defining the concept or skill, examples and non-examples. So what are examples of being responsible? What are non-examples? What does that look like? Have students apply the knowledge or skill. So actual guided practice with feedback can be very effective. And then, of course, differentiating instruction based on student need. So just like we would do with math or with reading, if you find there are students that need some additional learning with their behavioral skills, we would provide additional differentiated instruction based on need. So then looking at the difference in how you would teach those things, your expectations are really that concept level lesson where we're taking this thing that might be kind of abstract, like respect, and talking about what it looks like in different settings and how we would apply that. Rules are specific skills that need to be rehearsed in the setting you identified. Often some of your procedures need to be rehearsed as well. So you might see kids going and practicing, at the beginning of the year, you might see younger kids practicing in the cafeteria or practicing, what it looks like to walk in a line on campus.
And that's a really important point, that the lessons need to occur in the setting where they apply. So teaching them in isolation in itself, not related to the setting in which it applies to, would not be beneficial for the students. So that's really important when you're talking about walking in line in the hallway, that you do that lesson and that lesson occurs out in the hallway.
We also want to think about when we would implement lessons and how we would do that. So many schools, and I think some people mentioned in our chat earlier today, have some introductory events. So school-wide assemblies or rotating through classrooms to talk about school-wide rules, expectations, and student code of conduct. Our beginning of the year events also give opportunities for input from staff and families. So parents might be exposed to information about school-wide rules, anti-bullying programs, and things like that.
Then there's also opportunities throughout the year for ongoing formal lesson plans. Lots of schools had given feedback that they do it after winter break. So that's like the minimum requirement. They do it at the beginning of the year, like Molly just spoke of, and then after winter break also. But one important thing to really remember and to look at is to look at your data. Especially last year or the year before, see some trends. Is there a spike right before, you know, FCAT or FSA time? That might be a way to be preventative and proactive in embedding a lesson before that time if you see a spike in your data, discipline data at that time. So, and again, getting input then from staff and family feedback also about when are good times to do these lessons. Obviously, throughout the year, teachers in their classrooms might see an opportune time to kind of stop and do a lesson on the spot, right? So there's plenty of time and plenty of reasons why we need to have ongoing lesson plans and happening throughout the school year.
So some ideas for scheduling lessons throughout the year. It can be helpful to videotape at the beginning of the year when you introduce rules and expectations, so the new students coming into the building can watch that and have the benefit of that information as well. Some schools have involved students in making those videotapes, and it's a little more engaging for kids to watch. Morning announcements are a great time. You have the whole school's attention at that time to review information. Sometimes there's a homeroom or calendar time. Special area teachers can incorporate lessons. We mentioned making those connections with an art activity or a physical activity. Social skills information can be included with an elective class. Some schools I've seen at the secondary level doing some creative things with scheduling to allow additional time in the day. So I know I work with a middle school that found a way to shorten some of their other activities and carve out a 20-minute block of time each day to teach some citizenship skills. Community resources. So how can your community supports help with that lesson? And then, of course, linking with your family and community events. So doing a parent night, or if you're having like a fall festival or a winter concert, including some of that information with your community event.
So just something to remember, the more you teach and use the language of your Tier 1 expectations, the more effective you'll be in changing the behavior. So having things very visible for our students and our staff and faculty and our parents is, an important part of it.
So these are some informal ways that schools can support those more formal lessons and make these, these behavioral expectations and social skills more, more visible throughout the school community.
We wanted to hear from you guys to see, after you read through this list, what you guys do in your schools as informal ways to support your lessons or your school-wide expectations or rules. Here's one example, next one, that one school used.
So they had a little acronym and they put it on t-shirts so people would see it a little more easily.
So in an informal way that I know a lot of schools implement in their school is to reward appropriate behavior as it happens. Some people have school-wide incentives to make that happen. Some schools have school pledges or songs. You see the t-shirt that we're showing right now. Some people use their marquee. Is there anything else that somebody would like to share what you do at your school?
Okay, so a good example, having posters in the building and
Yeah.
doing a breakfast to recognize Student of the Month.
Excellent.
Great.
Okay, the next slide really talks about monitoring fidelity. And fidelity is really implementing something as intended. Okay, and this is the piece that so often kind of gets dropped for not for any bad intention, but it is kind of the missing link a lot of times when we're trying to implement something. So in order to kind of set each school up for success, it's a really good idea to make sure that the lesson times are on the master schedule. It kind of holds people accountable to that and makes everybody aware that that's the time that is agreed upon to do these specific lessons. Of course, at those times, then there could be administrative walkthroughs, or the PBS team could walk through to see different lessons. But it really, by putting it on the master schedule as such, it really emphasizes that it is a priority for our school. Also, one way for monitoring fidelity is to make sure that we're, again, visual, putting posters throughout the school, essays, pictures, using our fine arts programs for products as well.
And monitoring can also involve monitoring of learning. So, you can spot check and interview random students or staff members or even families to see, are they aware of the school-wide expectations. You might notice parents starting to use that language with their kids. So I remember being at a school in the pickup line and heard a parent using those specific words about, I think it was safe, respectful, and being a problem solver. So I knew that parent had kind of internalized those expectations from the school and was using them with their kids.
Okay, so just a little summary. Behavior instruction, like we talked about, it has to be systematic. It has to be consistent, pervasive, and ongoing. And you don't need to recreate the wheel. Sometimes it's good just to use what's already in place. You can reframe it to incorporate it within your Tier 1 language if need be. We need to use formal and informal instructional methods in order for that message and that language to be a consistent message throughout our school. Making lessons easy for staff to deliver is important. And then developing that system like we just talked about to ensure the fidelity piece so that we know everybody's held accountable and we're in consensus about what needs to happen. And then, of course, we talked about involving students. That's a really big piece that more and more schools are doing as we move forward. Families, community in the lesson plan development, implementation, or just in PBS in general.
So teaching expectations and rules. So this will be an activity for you to take back and engage in with your team when you're ready. So a couple of options. You can design your own lesson plan based on your existing expectations and rules once you're ready to do that. So you can build your own. You can also use what's available. So if you are identifying online resources or using a published curriculum, you can pull from that and identify what you want to explore further and what you want to modify to make it, make sure you're covering your specific school-wide expectations. And once you've identified some lesson plans to use, the next step is to start looking at your schedule for when and how you'll actually deliver that information. So that's just an overview of what some next steps would look like. So looking again at your action plan that your team is working on, specific items that you would consider for teaching expectations and rules. So again, you could record on your action plan that, depending on which option you're choosing, either developing some lesson plans together as a team, doing a web search, and then making that schedule for exactly how the lessons would be developed. And again, very important, we want to make sure we include some action items for how we'll inform and involve other individuals, staff, students, family, to make sure they're aware of the lesson plans, how they're being used, and have some input there as well.
Right, so a school newsletter, the school website are great examples to start reaching out to families and community members about the great things you're doing with PBS in your school.
And then, of course, if you're looking at your benchmarks of quality and you see that lesson plan for teaching expectation and rules really isn't there yet, or you have some low-scoring items there between items 29 and 34, you want to make sure that your action plan that you're working on with your team addresses those areas. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our slides for today. So for next time, when you go on Canvas under the Assignments tab, you have a little activity to complete after what you've listened to today. So it would be an upload of one document that includes these following items. And I know some schools already did number 1. So if you've already uploaded a matrix of rules for specific settings on your campus, you don't need to do that again. But for most of us, we'll be including that matrix of rules for a specific setting on campus. I'm choosing the place where you have the most office referrals to start with. So if it's your cafeteria, start there. If it's the bus, start there. An example of a lesson plan you would use to teach the rules, and again, that can be something that your team develops as an original lesson plan or something that you find from another resource that you would like to use, and an explanation of how and when the lesson plan would be implemented.
Right, and when you give the example of a lesson plan you would use to teach the rules, please be cognizant to use the setting, one of the top 3 settings after looking at your Pasco Star discipline data for that. So if you look in Pasco Star and the bus or the cafeteria has, the highest amount of office discipline referrals, then make sure that the example of your lesson plan is for one of those, 2 settings.
All right, that brings us to the end of our content for today, but we see a question, does it have to be the setting with the most referrals or one of the top 3?
Yep. One of the top 3 is fine.
Okay, and great, some good feedback. If you guys want to use these slides with your team, we're going to post them on the Canvas course, so you'll be able to access those, and we'll also post the recording of the conference. So if you have people that weren't able to listen today, but you want to share all or some of this with your team, you'll be able to do that through the Canvas course as well.
Thanks so much for your time, everybody. Have a great Friday and great weekend.
So that will conclude our Canvas conference. What I'm going to do is go ahead and sign off for now. If anyone is doing the Florida Positive Behavior Support data collection, so I think there are many people on here that are not involved with that, but if you are involved with that and you need help or have questions,